Renate Klein lives on Djiru country, far north Queensland. Renate is a Swiss-Australian radical lesbian feminist who has been critical of reproductive and genetic engineering since the early 1980s. She started Spinifex Press with Susan Hawthorne in 1991. Her next book is Radical Reckonings, Survival in Patriarchy, due out in late 2024. Susan Hawthorne lives on Djiru country, far north Queensland. Susan's radical feminism has inspired her to activism in politics and poetics. She is a poet, novelist, and theorist and has worked in publishing for 4 decades, including as co-founder of Spinifex. Her forthcoming book is Lesbian, Essays on Politics and Existence, also coming out in 2024. Renate Klein, over to you.
Hello, everyone, and hello, Janet, and thank you very much for inviting Susan and me to talk about Dale Spender and her wonderful life. And actually, I've been quite sad the whole day today. I'm not really sure why. And then I thought maybe it's because I've been thinking about Dale quite a lot. And, you know, Dale should be with us, doing one of these Women's Declaration International seminars and not be dead at, well, she was 80, but that's not such a high age. Anyway, Susan and I have written an obit for Dale, which is on the Spinifex site. So I'm going to use some of the same examples, but not all of them. Dale was hugely important in my life. In fact, she was one of about 5 women who have majorly impacted the direction my life has taken. I could be in a totally different space today if I hadn't met Dale. Now, how did I meet Dale? It's actually quite a funny story. That was a long way back in 1979. Dale was close to publishing man-made language and had been invited by the National Women's Studies Association to give a keynote. I had just finished, no, I hadn't read. I was studying and teaching women's studies at Berkeley University of California at Berkeley with Gloria Bowles. And I was really finding my way. I was still a bit sort of unsure where I was going, what I was doing, because I had been a biologist and had actually recently switched to becoming a women's studies person. And I would then write the book together with Gloria Bowles' Theories of Women's Studies. But in 1979, I was quite a young one and not sure really where to be. But I had applied for a PhD and I got 2 acceptances, one from New York and the other from London University. And so there was Dale, who lived in London, and I thought, I should really go over to her and ask her if that was a good idea, blah, blah, blah. And I was still, gathering my courage to go and speak to this quite famous woman. And I see her coming to me, absolutely straightforward to me, and she pointed at me and said, "Where did you get that raincoat from?" Now, my raincoat actually was red and not purple, because Dale, as you know, after a certain time, started to wear only purple. And she always liked purple, but my raincoat was red. I was so taken aback that this famous woman was asking me this question. But honestly, 10 minutes later, I had her address, her phone number. I had a woman who she said would help me find a place to stay in London, which she did. And I didn't know really what had happened. Then, when I did get to London, and that was on the 1st or maybe the beginning of January 1980, as a very, very cold day, and I drove from Zurich with my little red car to London. That was actually I was really quite afraid of how I would manage this. Had gotten indeed a little bedsit. It was totally new territory for me. But I arrived there, and you wouldn't believe it, that very evening I was already sitting at a meeting with Dale of one of the many feminist collectives that she would introduce me to. That was Dale. She always helped women to find their feet, to do something new, to get over their fear, because fear it certainly was for me at the beginning, and to help them achieve more and more. So Dale introduced me to heaps of feminists. She introduced me to a lot of her work. Mostly, I would go over to Dale's place a couple of days every week. Took me about more than 1.5 hours to go over there with the tube and walking and bus, blah, blah. And almost every day when I arrived there, which would have been around maybe 9:30 or so, Dale was already sitting there writing, and we often would start the day by her reading me the latest installment of what she had written during the night, because Dale was a night owl. She worked a lot during the night, smoking and drinking, as she wrote. So I got privy to hear lots and lots of what would become one of her famous work, Women of Ideas and What Men Have Done to them, which was absolutely fascinating. That's right. There's the book there. If you haven't read this book, please do yourself a favor and enjoy it, read it. It is so full of information. Dale just went to the British Museum, found all these lost women, and found, of course, so much material, because it wasn't that there was no material, but nobody had bothered talking about it, and then got it together in this fantastic book. And of course, the subtitle was really good. Women of Ideas and What Men Have Done to Them. So Dale, of course, herself was a woman of ideas. And as I said already before, she encouraged other women to do as many things as they wanted. Like, for me, she said, well, you're good at writing and good at editing. I didn't hardly knew what that was. Would you like to help me with Women's Studies International Forum, the journal that she had started in 1978? Yes, of course, I said. And so before I knew it, I was not quite before I knew it, but in a couple of years or so, I was becoming the European editor. And it was such an exhilarating place to be, because especially at that time, until maybe about the year 2000, Women's Studies International Forum had mostly radical feminist articles, and to be in touch with all the writers was just fabulous. There was a funny moment also, because the supervisor where I had started my PhD with, and my PhD actually was, you would be surprised, those of you who know my work on reproductive technology, nothing of the sort. It was a very giant investigation into the women power and the theoretical power of women's studies as an international movement. I did get it finished in the end, but it was interrupted by all my other work, including all the work I did on reproductive technologies. Anyway, my supervisor and I soon didn't really get along. And I think it was that she didn't really like my radical feminism, as simple as that. But what she said to me, she said, I think your English isn't good enough. And so my dear Dale actually took the pages that I had written, edited them, added her own little bits, and I then submitted that to Margarita, was the unfortunate woman's name, and got it back with exactly the same comments. Unfortunately, your English isn't quite up to scratch. And Dale and I, honestly, we almost rolled ourselves laughing. Because one thing about Dale, those of you who've never met her, she was one of the wittiest persons that I've ever known. She just laughed so much and was really actually an incurable optimist. Well, we did that about 2 or 3 times until obviously I realized I was never going to get my PhD. And so gradually I changed to another supervisor. But that was very, very funny that Dale helped me with that, and that didn't actually work. I think another thing to say about Dale is that not only did she encourage women to start doing work that they, felt maybe not quite up to it, but she also encouraged them to really start like publishing houses. So, for instance, the Pandora Library, and the middle book here that's on the screen, there's always been a women's movement this century, was certainly one of these groups, and I think there were more, at least about 10 books that were published, all by different women, and Dale enabled that. She was a great synthesizer and a great enabler. There was a funny story that went along with that. There's always been a women's movement this century. This is the notion that some people said, oh, yeah, there's been the movement for women's suffrage, but then there was nothing between that and the women's liberation movement, which, of course, was rubbish. There have always been feminists that have done things. And so we should actually take heart of this, because even today, when we feel like, well, the masses of the women's liberation movement are really nowhere to be seen anymore, there are feminists, and like us here speaking at Women's Declaration International, there will always be pockets of feminists, often radical feminists, and continue our work. Anyway, Dale and I went to see Dora Russell. Now, some of you may know about Bertrand Russell, a philosopher, had to go to jail because he challenged the government, and so on and so on. Hardly anybody knew about Dora Russell, his wife. She had done many, many things before. She'd worked on a peace wagon, and she'd written quite a lot of books. Anyway, I remember we walked in there, and she did serve us a cup of tea, and then she started to berate us, like, well, these young women, obviously she thought we were very young. I mean, we were already into our 40s. We didn't know what we were doing. We shouldn't be doing what we were doing. We should be doing other things. And what I remember is that we actually exited her house quite soon, and felt really quite like bedraggled rats, because she'd given us a bit of a sermon. However, I think Dale must have gone back to her and interviewed her again, because I just reread the chapter today. It's a fabulous chapter about what Dora Russell did, all the things she did. Now, she was treated so badly, nothing new in that, by her famous husband. So that was a very funny story. And another funny story with Dale was when I took her to Switzerland, where my best Swiss friend, her family had a house in St. Moritz. So we were there, and my best friend had a very stupid husband, who constantly criticized Dale and me and our feminism. And I was just about to give him a serve. And all of a sudden, Dale, who had tried to nicely, argue with him in a nice way, all of a sudden she looked at his hands and said, "Oh, Paul, I have just never seen a man with such nice hands." And I was just stunned, and then I had to get up and run out, because so I could finally laugh. And you wouldn't believe it, he fell for it and said, "Oh, that's nice of you, that's really nice." And so Dale did very unexpected things, because it's the same thing as much later in the 80s in Australia, when you might not believe this, but the government once had a non-sexist policy, non-sexist language policy, and this just had been proclaimed. And Dale, of course, was interviewed a lot because she'd written Man-Made Language. And some clever journalist, a boy, went up to her and said, "Now, Dale, what do you think about manholes?" And immediately she said, "Well, there should be more of them." And it was such wit, that we all just fell about laughing, that had other people, they couldn't really, they couldn't get to it. They just thought, "Oh, well, what is this woman?" But Dale also had her limits, and I actually sadly had to witness that. She didn't suffer fools gladly. I mean, who does? And it was this book, For the Record. I think it was on the previous screen, on this one. For the Record is a collection of interviews and accounts that Dale wrote with quite famous feminists. So from Betty Friedan to Kate Millett to Germaine Greer to Robin Morgan, Shulamit Firestone, and so on and so on. Phyllis Chesler, I mean, it had an awful lot of. Adrienne Rich has a lot of really important women in it. Then what Dale did, she wrote her piece on these women, and then she sent them her piece and asked them to comment on it, which, I mean, demands some courage. And then about 10 of them wrote back, and she also included these comments in her in the book. And lo and behold, the book was really just about to be published by the Women's Press, and some very, very inexperienced, stupid copy editor at the latest minute changed so much. And it was not just, little language changes, it was actually meaning changes. And when Dale got that, and remember, so it was 82, I think, at the time. Remember, there's no internet at the time, no email. Everything was, you had to do it on paper. And I remember when Dale got this, she was absolutely devastated. It was really bad. I was walking with her. She wanted to go out and walk, and we were walking around. She was actually really seriously, almost suicidal, saying, "I can't do this. I'm going to throw myself over the bridge." I have never seen her that bad. What I can't remember is whether that got actually rectified or whether the book came out with all these mistakes. I just read quite a bit in it today, and I can't see any obvious mistakes, but, you just don't know. But that was really something that Dale, she had enough with that. She couldn't deal with that. And then, unfortunately, when she moved back to Australia, which was in 1986, that's also the year that I went to Australia. I got a 6-month scholarship to do research on women who had gone through IVF, and Dale moved back for good. And I have to say that the Australian feminists really started to treat her extremely badly. She didn't get any support from them at all, except, and I must say that, Robin Rowland and I from Deakin University, and Betty McClellan and Coralie in Cairns. We had summer institutes, women and winter institutes, and Dale was a very welcome speaker to all of this, and the students had an absolute ball. So Dale's encouragement of other women, I don't know anybody else who has done more for that. And I'll come to an end. I mean, it's incredibly sad that such a brilliant woman, a woman of ideas, then comes down with, dementia. And so for the last 5 years, unfortunately, she couldn't live at home anymore. So she lived in a old people's home where she was cared for, but for instance, she couldn't have her little dog with her, and she could not have any alcohol. And Dale had, quite liked to drink a bottle of Prosecco, and it was her sister Lynn who was her biggest and confidant throughout all her life, who smuggled in little bottles of Prosecco so that Dale would at least have some little comfort. That made us all very, very sad, and there's nothing, we can do about. And really, this awful disease, catches the brightest and the best. Nobody knows what to do about that. So I'm handing over to Susan now, and who will talk about quite some other things that the importance that Dale had in her life. I really miss her. I miss her greatly.
Thank you, Renate. I didn't get to meet Dale until considerably later, but I did hear about her book, Man-Made Language. A friend of mine said, I have to read it, and it sounded like something I would enjoy. So I was very surprised to discover that she was Australian, because I hadn't heard of her. But I do have a vague memory of standing in Regan's bookshop in Carlton in Melbourne and hearing somebody say, "That's Dale Spender."
And by that stage, I knew who she was because I was working in a feminist library, and I had actually realised that she had already written something like 9 books. And then, as Renate said, her book, Women of Ideas and What Men have Done to Them, came out. And I love the way that the word them is a double entendre. It's that what men have done to women's ideas and what men have done to women. It's very, very clever. Then a number of years passed, and in 1986 I applied for a job as an editor at Penguin Books. And I didn't get the job, but about 4 or 5 months after my interview, they called me in for another session. I got an interview with Jackie Gowell and Brian Johns at McCoppen's Bar in Collingwood, a great, meeting place for publishing people. Anyway, so they interviewed me and I got that job. It was also around the same time that I met Renate. We met down at Deakin, although Renate didn't see me the day I saw her. But some weeks later we met. Anyway, my job at Penguin that I've got the interview for was to start at the beginning of the following year, so 1987. And Renate said, "Oh, would you like to come and meet Dale Spender?" And I said, "Oh, yes, that would be great." Anyway, it turned out that evening that Dale told me that she had put in a proposal to Penguin for a book series called the Penguin Australian Women's Library. And so you can see all the books here in this. And I mean, it's an incredible list of books. Among them are things like The Fortunes of Mary Fortune, which is a book about by a 19th century crime writer that Lucy Sussex edited. But there were also fantastic things like Novelist, which is set in far North Queensland, and Mr. Hogarth's Will Perkins Find. And what I had a great time doing was finding covers for these books. So this one here, Mr. Perkins Find, the painting is by Clara Southern, who's become very famous since then. Mr. Hogarth's Will, the painting by Vida Leahy. And then there's absolutely fabulous cover on the No Vertican book, which is by Margaret Bevan and called The Drover's Wife. But not only did she bring novels from earlier times, she also brought this book, The Peaceful Army, which was, it's interesting doing it right now because it came out in 1938, which was the sesquicentenary of Australia. And it's edited by Flora Eldershaw. Flora Eldershaw was the other half of M. Barnard Eldershaw, lesbian writing there. And in it, it's got fabulous pieces by Mary Gilmore, Winsmith Hustack, Eleanor Dark, and just incredible stuff. Margaret Preston. So the women of that period, it was a bit like, in a way, the Dora Russell book in the UK. And then she also brought out anthologies. Her selection of books that was edited by Lynn Spender, her sister, which is the writings of 19th century women, and Bright and Fiery Truth, which are academic essays of that same period. But she didn't just do the books from the past, she also did, she did this incredible, look at this incredible book called The Penguin Anthology of Australian Women's Writing, which starts with a piece by a convict woman called Margaret Catchpole and ends with Antigone Kefala, who was a Greek-Australian writer living in Sydney, and Germaine Greer. And then she brought out an anthology of contemporary Australian women writers. And that one begins with Barbara Jeffries on a piece about the drover's wife and Diane Bell and Robin Archer. And it finishes with a piece by a play by Sarah Hardy. So that takes us through to about 1990. But at the same time she was doing this, she was, as Renate said, involved with Pandora Press, and she did these books. So the Mothers of the Novel was a kind of history of British women's writing, and then the other one, 2 Centuries of Australian Women's Writing, was a comparable sort of book about Australian writing. And then there's this book, The Incredible Journey by Catherine Martin, which is about an Aboriginal woman's journey across country. So she was doing really quite extraordinary things. And the Pandora and the Penguin were going together, so obviously she didn't have any time to sleep. But then, just going back to the Penguin, Spinifex distributed some of these books for a little while, but the only one we could get the rights to was The Peaceful Army. So you can actually get that as an ebook from us. Then in 1995, we published her book, Nattering on the Net. And I think Dale agreed. We had only set up Spinifex in 1991, and I think in 92 or 3 she said, you can have my next book, which is sort of like what she did elsewhere. She enabled, she opened doors. So for us, as a tiny press, I mean, we didn't even have 20 books at that time. Her giving us this really important book was a great act of generosity. And a woman who worked in the State Library of Victoria said of the book that it was incredibly readable, and it was revolutionary in the way of Negroponte. So in Melbourne, well, not long after Nattering on the Net was published, she gave a keynote speech in Melbourne in which she spoke about truth. And she said that truth used to be something that was enduring, that people through generations had agreed was important. Now, she says, truth is what's most recent. The last time we saw Dale was in 2014 at a conference, feminist conference in Brisbane. So like Renate, I miss Dale, I miss her energy, her wildness, her irascibility, her ability to answer back really, really fabulously quickly. So I hope that some of these books will get onto your reading list. Thank you.
Renate, that was really beautiful and moving. And yes, I remember Dale Spender's work from my feminist activism. I had friends who were mentors for me. So thank you so much.